Now that this summer's drought has finally come to an end, I thought you might be interested to see what the long-term effects on the garden here at Caerhays have been. Every gardener really enjoys looking at other people's disasters in their gardens, and I'm very happy to share this one with you. When we look back on this drought summer, my conclusion is that it was nowhere near as bad as 1976, and I hope to be able to show you that in this short film. The first major casualty, or near casualty, of the 2022 drought has been the hydrangeas. 10 days ago you would have said these plants were dead. Now that we've finally had a bit of rain, you can see that they've perked up a bit, but that we've got a good 2 foot of dieback. We've got some pretty sickly looking hydrangeas, and I would say that the worst of the two are pretty near dead. More to the point, those plants which are still look fairly alive or have recovered, all the flowers have shriveled up. We're not going to be able to cut and dry any hydrangeas this year. What's left is rather shriveled and pathetic when you look at it closely. Nevertheless, the plant's okay, but all around the garden there are clumps of hydrangeas which look half dead, won't flower very much next year, and some of them have died completely. In 1976, the effects of the drought were felt most on mature beech trees. And by mature, I probably mean something that was 80 to 120 years old, and they lost the top 20 or 30 feet of their crowns, and it probably took 20 years for those to grow back. If we look at 2 or 3 mature beech trees today, you can see that although autumn is fast approaching, you can see that there is no dieback from their crowns, and the beech trees this time have done very much better. But the extraordinary thing is that while the beeches have done better, the older sycamores are in a dire state. We're looking at just one tree here, and you can see how 2/3 of the leaves already dropped off. That was the case way back in mid-August, and if you look on the ground you can see the premature leaf fall all around. It's the sycamores that I think will be rushing more to their deaths or premature deaths this year. I'm sure they will come into leaf again next year, but I'm equally sure this is probably knocked 10 or so years off their potential lives with the stress of the drought this year. So then let's look at what the drought has done to magnolias, and the effects are quite alarming. This was a 10-15-year-old Magnolia Sibaldii, and as the drought came, the main stem lost its leaves. You can see how it tried to put on a crop of seeds before it died, but basically it's died back, and this whole main stem is dead. The few younger suckers coming from the bottom of the plant, they've still got a few leaves left on them, and so basically what we've got to do here is remove that central trunk and allow the plant to regenerate again itself. But I'm now going to show you magnolias in a far worse state than this. So this is a very ancient Magnolia Dawsoniana. It was planted here almost exactly 100 years ago, and when you look at the branches you see that about 20 years ago we pollarded it at about 20 or 30 feet to rejuvenate it, which it did, and you can see the new growth coming. But you can also very clearly see that this very old tree has lost maybe 2/3 to 3/4 of its leaves. You can see a few buds for next spring. The tree isn't dead, but it's severely stunted, and those leaves dropping prematurely means that it's missed, at least 2 months of growth, photosynthesis, and basically well-being. And the drought has taken that away and probably speeded up the demise of this old original plant, which was once a seed in China. That's the effect of the drought. It's not immediate, but it is perhaps not quite life-threatening to trees like this, but it's certainly speeding up the demise of very old plants. In 1976, the worst drought year, the plants which suffered most in the garden here were the big leaf rhododendrons. Rhododendron sinograndi and Rhododendron maccabianum. And they simply couldn't stand the drought, and all the plants which were then 40 to 60 years old died, and we had to start again with new ones which are now 40 years old. And I'm standing under a 40-year-old Rhododendron sinograndi, and you can see how the new growth is absolutely minimal, literally an inch long. The second year leaves are all scorched and burnt. You can almost feel that that is frazzled and about to die. And frankly, if this plant survives, it'll be nothing. It's had it, perhaps not quite as certainly as in 76, but it's had it. But anyway, let me now turn and look at some smaller, younger plants and what we've been able to do to save them. So these are 6 or 7 year old from planting sinograndi seedlings. You can see what's happened in the drought. All their secondary leaves, which would have been hung on there and make the plant look much more attractive, they've dropped in the drought. The size of the leaves on the new growth is tiny. It's about a fraction, perhaps 20% of the size they should normally be. You've got little dead branches. But if we move over to some other plants here, we started watering them just in time. We came up here with large cans of water, and the first day the water was all running off, as it would in a thunderstorm. It wasn't going into the plant. It was only on the second day that you could actually get the water to go into the ground on the roots of this plant. And look how much better it is than the one we just looked at. A lot of the second year leaves are still on the plant as they should be. The new growth is appreciably larger and has probably done quite a bit better this year. And this plant will survive, but it probably wouldn't have. And I don't think that one over there that we just looked at will, or it won't ever make a decent plant anyway. This plant has survived because we managed to get some water on it. Now look at this plant, it's even better. It's held all its leaves. You see this yellowing in the leaf. That's not autumn, that's drought stress. But this plant is perfectly all right. I might even go as far as to say it's looking well. But that's just what a little bit of watering has done. And here you see another triumph with rather a lot of water. This is the very rare Rhododendron eximium, and you can see that with a bit of water it looks perfectly normal, unlike the Rhododendron sinograndi behind it, which looks painful and near dead. And what you see on this rhododendron is that the drought came so early that the flowers never dropped. They were literally shriveled and dried up on the tree, which is actually, well, there's one that did swell up, but in the main the seeds haven't set. Very often in a drought a plant realizes its life's threatened and it overflowers and overseeds, wasting a great deal of energy producing an enormous great seed pod like that. The plant is saying, I think I'm going to die, I better set some seed before I do. Here, fortunately, it hasn't done that, but one of the reasons that these big leaf rhododendrons do die in drought is that they waste a lot of energy trying to put on a lot of flower, which then hastens their demise. Before we go patting ourselves on the back too much, of course you only water a few very important plants. This is much more typical of how 5 to 10-year-old rhododendrons look after the drought. Stunted, horrible, even more horrible, only marginally alive and probably going to die. And there are many, many examples of this. I'll show you just a few more. Here's another typical disaster area. So the plant put on its new growth, and then the drought came and that new growth all died back. Now we finally had a little bit of rain. It's starting to shoot lower down. Side shoots are coming, so the plant is still, in theory, vigorous, but it might take another 5 years and no more dry summers to recover and be able to flower in May, June, as this species normally does. Not perhaps terminal in this case, but a very major setback to what is, after all, a young plant coming into its prime. So then we get into more of a real disaster. Here's a Sorbus thompsoni, a very rare species, which was planted here in 2010. It's grown extremely well and it has flowered and set seed in previous years. But from about the first week in August, it started to drop its leaves. And as you can see, there's virtually no leaves left at all on this plant. And when you look closely, you can see leaf buds for next year. So it might come into leaf again, but we know that actually those leaf buds are tiny in comparison to what you would expect if the leaf had dropped here normally in late November. So this tree, which is way out in the open and subject to the beating sun and heat of the drought, has reacted by dropping its leaves. Probably, we hope it'll survive, but it may well not. A 12-year-old tree, that's a fairly major disaster. So then we come on to the new plantings we made this spring, and that is absolutely typical of how a young magnolia shriveled and died in the drought. And I'm afraid there are really quite a lot of those dotted around the garden. But it's not all bad news. About the 15th or 20th of August, I passed by this young rhododendron and declared it dead. All its leaves had flopped. A lot of the leaves were brown and shriveled. But when the rain came on about the 3rd of September, miraculously it sprung back into life. I wish I could say that that happened more often, but if ever there was a plant that I'd written off and has come back to life, that's it. I think there are two great lessons from this drought, and we're standing in a newly cleared area where there was tree cover and shade from large beech trees which were felled because they were dying. And the reality is that what was a shady, warm, comfortable area for young plants has suddenly become a hothouse. And you can see what's happened to this oak here. You've got dieback. It's struggling to put up new growth again now that the rain has come. But everywhere we look in this new planting, you see plants that are struggling, half dead, not terribly well. And I think that the first message that I would convey to you is that if we're going to get summers like this, we really do need to concentrate our planting where there is more dappled shade, where you can't water everything, but in dappled shade, a lot of these newly planted plants have a much better chance of survival. And the second point to make is that these plants here were planted in the spring. Quite a few of these things down here were planted in the autumn. And if you take this rare plant here, yes, it struggled in the heat of its position, but because it was planted in the autumn, it got its roots out into the ground it was able to cope with the drought far better than the spring planted things. And I think the moral for the future of woodland gardening is that we need to plant far more in the autumn, which is nature's natural time for planting, because it gives plants so much better a chance. And the concept of planting rhododendrons in April, as we traditionally would, I think that, unless you've got access to infinite amounts of water, I think that goes by the by as well. But if you look here, you can see just here and there how this plant is now recovering and getting, a nice bit of secondary new growth is coming. This plant is going to be fine, but I wouldn't say for one second that the couple of these others here we've just looked at, I wouldn't say they were going to be fine at all. If they do survive, they'll be stunted, rather horrible specimens that no one will want to look at. But we just need to go on and look at a few other effects of the drought before we close up. So the conclusion of the 2022 drought is that, yes, we've had casualties, although nothing like as severe a casualties as 1976. We've got a very premature autumn, as you can see on this wonderful snakebark maple and many other trees. I don't think that will have any lasting effects, and I don't think early autumn colour will have that lasting an effect. But I do think that it has brought closer to the end a number of mature trees, whether they be common trees like sycamores or very rare trees, one or two of which we've seen in the garden. Possibly the most alarming thing is what I'm going to show you next. If we look up at this 120-year-old Pinus radiata, you see basically the crown has dropped. During the drought it hadn't got the energy to service its crown, and the needles are very sparse. What's more, we're seeing bark cracking off at the base, and I'm quite sure that this Pinus radiata would have lived a lot longer if it hadn't had the drought this year. At the end of the day, though, it probably hasn't been as bad as we thought it was going to be on about the 20th of August. In 1976, the drought started on the 23rd of April and finished in the first week of September, and we had virtually no rain throughout that time. This year we were lucky because in Cornwall we did have, on about the 12th or 14th of July, we did have a decent little bit of rain overnight, and we've had a few days with drizzle. Drizzle is really good because it damps everything down. Without that, I think we would have been far worse. I think we've learnt a few lessons, but I think next spring will be fine when the gardens are at their best again.